Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. François, thank you for joining us. You are essentially our keynote speaker. So,
I'll do my best.
so François, I'm really pleased to have François here. He is a political scientist, and he's working on migration governance and especially related to climate change. He, as was mentioned, he's the director of the Hugo Observatory, and he's also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So I think it's a great privilege to be able to have this conversation with you.
Well, wait until the conversation is over.
Well, myself, I'm a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. And my interest is currently on forced migration and how it relates to new sources of information, mainly online data. So I've also carried out some work with the UN Refugee Agency on projecting the future size and composition of displaced populations. And this is something related to the topic that we're going to be handling today. But as you know, today we will be focusing on climate migration, climate-induced migration. So maybe before we start, would you like to say something about yourself?
No, only that this topic, climate-induced migration, is really at the crossroads of two of the key challenges of our time. Obviously, one of them is refugees and forced migration and migration dynamics, the other one being climate change. And both issues pretty much ask the same question, which is about what is the relationship we want to have with the other and how do we see our place in the world.
So I think I would like to start, well, as a good academic, I would like to start with some definitions. Because I think there are many terms that we use all the time, maybe, but we really have to think about what they mean. So the first thing that I would like to ask you, François, is when we speak about climate-induced migration, what are we actually speaking about?
Well, broadly speaking, we're talking about all the people who have to move, forcibly or voluntarily, as a result of the degradation of their environment, if this degradation is related to climate change. So we're talking about people displaced as a result of disasters like hurricanes or floods or droughts, but also people displaced by the slow onset creeping impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise or soil degradation, for example. And when we ask ourselves whether or not it makes sense to speak of climate-induced migration, I think, yes, it is important to speak of climate-induced migration because it is a way to recognize that one of the key impacts of climate change on populations will be significant migration and displacement. And yet, at the same time, it is also important to note that the drivers of migration are increasingly intermingled with each other, which means that it makes not a lot of sense to actually distinguish between categories of migration depending on the motive of migration. We are no longer in the situation of the 1950s or the 1960s where people would migrate from A to B from one specific reasons. Today, we see that the environmental factors, the political factors, the economic factors of migration are really intermingled with each other and actually influence each other. And that is this mix of migration drivers that makes people move, and that the economic drivers or the political drivers of migration are also influenced by environmental factors. I just want to take the example of the migrants currently arriving in Europe to the shores of Italy, Spain, or Greece. Some of them are coming from Western Africa. And in sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the population depends on subsistence agriculture for one's livelihoods. Which means that for a lot of the people on the planet, their economic livelihood depends directly on environmental conditions. For you and me, and I guess most in the audience, our paycheck at the end of the month will not depend on the weather. But for most of the people on the planet, their livelihood, their economic resources are directly related to the state of the environment. And therefore, many of the people we call economic migrants coming to Europe today, we could as well call them environmental migrants or climate refugees, simply because for them, the economics and the environment actually means the same thing. It is very much a Western view to distinguish between the environment and the economics, whereas when your livelihood depends directly on agriculture, for example, that means that the environment and the economics for you is the same thing. And possibly the way we address the so-called economic migrants in Europe would change a lot if we were to call them climate migrants or climate refugees.
Yeah, which I think brings me to the next point that I wanted to discuss, which is that the term climate refugee doesn't actually have any legal validity. And quoting from a recent UNHCR report, they say that many of those displaced by climate change do not meet the definitions of refugee. And there are different terms that people use. I think the two most common ones are environmental refugees and climate refugees. And I think the definition of these terms is not always entirely clear, and that has led to wildly different predictions also about the future number of refugees.
Sure, it is true to say that technically speaking, climate refugees or environmental refugees, that's a misnomer. They are not, in international law, refugees, simply because when the drafters of the Geneva Convention met in 1951 to draft the Geneva Convention that sets out the criteria that grant refugee status, well, they simply did not mention the environmental drivers as one of the key reasons that could grant people a refugee status. So in all migration law and migration policies, the environmental drivers of migration have consistently been forgotten. I think that while at the same time, we need to recognize that, yes, technically speaking, they are not entitled to any kind of refugee status or to any kind of international protection for that matter, I think it is also important to recognize that there are victims of persecution. And really the very foundation of the refugee status is the idea that people are victims of a persecution and need to seek asylum somewhere else. And when we speak of climate-induced migrants, or I've even seen people on the move in the context of climate change, we tend to forget that climate change is also a form of persecution that we are inflicting upon the most vulnerable people on this planet. We know very well what the effects of climate change are. We know that some of these effects will imply the displacements of thousands and millions of people. And while we continue emitting greenhouse gas emissions, we are also responsible of that persecution that we're inflicting to the most vulnerable. And for that reason only, and even though it is not correct from a legal point of view, I think it is, politically speaking, I think there is a very good reason to speak of climate refugees or of environmental refugees to recognize that they're the victims of a persecution that we're inflicting upon them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, so I think now that we have tried and failed to find specific definitions for these terms, we can move on to the other topic that brought us here, which is technology. So I know that you have extensive experience and also are involved in several projects which are working with technology and as they relate to climate-induced migration. So I was wondering if you could just tell us what your general idea is of the role of technology in dealing with climate-induced forced migration.
Well, technology today is very important in the field, at least in the studies and in the policies on climate-induced migration. And there is a lot we can do through technology to address climate-induced migration. I just want to point out a few examples. For example, we now work with mobile phone data. And these mobile phone data, when a disaster strikes, can really indicate us very soon, immediately, how the people are being displaced, where the refugee camps are being formed. And this is really a tool that can help us direct the assistance and humanitarian aid immediately where it is needed the most. And so we have agreements with mobile phone operators in a series of countries. And thanks to these anonymized data, we are able to actually track the patterns of displacement and to see when the people are able to return. We can see if the people come and go, and in a way we can really see how people are being displaced in real time. So this is one example that is extremely helpful for directing humanitarian aid. Obviously, we also use technology a lot for early warning systems. And in order to warn people in advance when a disaster is about to strike, it is absolutely necessary that they have access to those data and to the early warning system. And even when we're discussing about the slow onset impacts of climate change, the role of climate information is extremely important. And very often people do not have access to climate information. And therefore they will make their decision to migrate on the basis of their perceptions of climate impacts. And their perceptions will often be very different from reality. Sometimes the perceptions of the impacts of climate change will be the opposite of the observed impacts. People will have the impression that it rains less, whereas it rains actually more, or the other way around. And therefore, giving people access to climate information is essential. And technology can help us a lot in providing that climate information to the people. The final point that I wanted to make, and you see some images in the background, is that now, in order to track displacement and to study displacement in the long run, we also work a lot with satellite images. And so we work with NASA. We'll start a new program soon with the French National Center for Space Studies. So we use these satellite data actually to model the patterns of displacement and the patterns of migration. And these images really help us model the patterns of future migration so that we can predict, to a certain extent, how people will be moving under the influence of climate change.
Yeah, and I guess that's, so far we have discussed a couple of ways in which technology can be helpful to mitigate and adaptate to changes in climate. And also something related to nowcasting that you mentioned. And if you're not familiar with the term, it's the idea that instead of forecasting, we can just show what's happening in real time using different sources of information. And then in the end, you touched upon the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which is predictions. So do you think that we will ever be able to predict a phenomenon as complex as forced migration? And maybe it's also a matter of the time frames that we're speaking about. Like maybe it is possible to provide early warning systems, which is a way of predicting, but it's one that doesn't leave you a lot of time for planning.
It is, of course, extremely difficult to make a global prediction of the number of people who will be displaced in the future as a result of climate change, simply because this will not depend only on climate change. This will also depend on the policies that we'll be implementing, that will depend on people's personal characteristics and behaviors. So there are lots of things in that are difficult to model. There are some aspects that we can model, others that are difficult, if not impossible, to model. Yet, every time you speak with a policymaker, every time you try to design solutions to address climate-induced migration, their first question is always, how many people are we talking about? How many people will be displaced in the future? And therefore, there is a need for numbers for policymakers. And therefore, we need to make predictions because they can help policymakers plan for the future and anticipate the future impacts of climate change. But there are two dangers and two biases associated with these predictions. The first one is that they might give the impression that climate-induced migration is just a kind of distant threat in the future, whereas it is actually happening now. And it requires policies and responses right now, and therefore predictions might actually give the false idea that we don't have to deal with climate-induced migration now, and that if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions soon enough, then we won't have to deal with climate-induced migration. That's the first bias. The second danger, I think, is that by providing global figures and predictions, you can easily feed the fear-mongering machine about migration. The idea that tomorrow will be submerged by migration waves that will become out of control. And if you don't pay attention to that, you can fuel the xenophobic feelings of governments and of the populations and give the impression that migration will be something completely out of control tomorrow, and that therefore the response would be to close up the borders even further than they are today. So you really need to walk a fine line between providing policymakers with the tools that will help them anticipate future migration flows without feeding into the fear-mongering machine, and that's often a very fine line to walk, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes it's difficult to make predictions.
And I think there is also a trap that is inherent to these processes that you were describing, which is the fact that the media is very hungry for numbers and for sensational headlines. And therefore, the more sensational that your prediction is in terms of the number, the more likely it is that it's going to get coverage.
Of course. Every time you provide an estimate or a range of scenarios, the media will always pick up the most pessimistic, the most alarmist scenarios. And I think that our role as researchers is also to show populations and governments that there are ways that such migration can be addressed, that it's not a fatality or an unavoidable byproduct of climate change, but that migration can even be a resource and can be an adaptation tool for the people themselves, and that people, if the right policy frameworks are in place, that the people can use their migration as a way to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and that there are ways to manage this and to organize such migration flows in the best interest of everyone.
So I would like to turn your attention in these last minutes that we have to the role of new sources of data, big data in particular, and data analytics. And do you think that these are sources that are actually going to improve our understanding of forced migration?
Well, it has to. I mean, our prediction used to be very bad. Now they are just bad. So there is definitely a lot of room for improvement, and I think big data can help a lot in this. Another very promising research technique that is currently being tested and experimented is agent-based modeling, that is computer-based simulation of the human behavior, so that we could kind of model what the reactions of people would be under a certain set of parameters. So in a way, we would model future migration behavior. That is still very experimental, but this is progressing every day. A few months ago, the World Bank published an important report called the Groundswell Report that significantly improved our capacity to predict climate-induced migration, and clearly big data and technology will help a lot in this way. But it can also help not just to predict future flows, but also to assist, manage, and organize the current flows so that the people can really mitigate the impacts of climate change and try and make the best out of their migration.
So for those of you who maybe are not familiar with this idea of agent-based modeling, it's a statistical technique, or like a modeling technique rather, where you basically create simplified versions of individuals and put them in a computer simulation, and then you give them some simple rules and they interact with each other, and you can create some conditions, introduce some disturbances in these dynamics, and then you're basically modeling a simulated human population within a computer.
I'm sure you know The Sims, the video game.
Yes.
It's a little bit like The Sims, but the serious version of it.
To conclude, I would like to ask you what future opportunities you see for applying new sources of data.
I think that one of the key issues when it comes to data will be in the future the availability of data for governments of developing countries. I'm always flabbergasted to see that in many countries that are really at the forefront of climate change, we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, governments and the authorities have no data whatsoever on the population flows within their country. They don't know where people are moving, they don't know in which circumstances they are moving. So really we need to improve a lot the quality and the availability of statistical data on population movements. And I believe that technology can help us a lot in also providing access to governments so that they can take the adequate policies and so that they can stop being in the dark as they are today with regard to population data, but also with regard to some extent to climate data.
Right, thank you. And perfect timing as well. So if we could have a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thanks, François.